you very much indeed. Thanks, first of all, for the invitation to meet with you today. I have to apologise for this. This is normally very impolite in a situation like this, but I am the person who's going to be phoned by the people who deliver lunch. So I'm sure you can live with it.
I mean, looking forward to it.
It's also interesting to be sitting in company with people who have spent time inside. And Lisi. I sometimes tell people that during the 70s, when I lived in Beirut, I did contract work for the PLO. Which can also be seriously misunderstood. Right. You mentioned very briefly in your introduction talk about the business about biased information flows. At one level, one is almost tempted to say, yeah, what do you expect? All information flows are biased. And whether they're European, North American, West European, East European, Arab, West Mediterranean, East Mediterranean, South Asian, they're all in one way or another biased. What I find, we're sitting here in Denmark, we're sitting in Northern Central Europe, and so the information flow bias that concerns us here is the one that we live in, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the justification for dealing with this, to try and get behind that bias. First of all, I think the first message that has come across since this whole sequence of events blew up just before New Year, almost a year ago, with the events in Tunisia, is the way in which we have been presented with the events as if they are all one big common process. I want to pull that apart a bit. It is not what happens in Tunisia is not the same as what happens in Egypt, is not the same as what happens in Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Morocco, etc., etc., etc. There are, of course, that's undeniable, there are, of course, flashovers. Things that happen in one country that spark something else in the other country, but the other country is different, so what it sparks is different in one way or another. And of course, the two big themes in Western public discussion about this, both in the media and among politicians, has been, interestingly, in the first phase, it was the danger of Islamism, of Islamic politics taking control. Was this the opportunity for the Muslim Brotherhood finally to take control? That fear got a lower profile for a period. It seems to be coming back more recently with the elections, first in Tunisia and the expected results in Egypt. But the other thing that very quickly came up and is still very much towards the end, to the top end of the media political profile, is this whole business about democratization. There is clearly a tone of triumphalism in the way the Western media and politicians are dealing with this, as if we have won the ideological battle. Democracy is taking over. The youth of the Arab world, etc., etc. But hang on, what's actually happened in Egypt so far? The president has disappeared, and that's all. There has still not been a system or regime change. The military is still in control behind the scenes. It may change with the sequence of elections which are going to take place over the coming year, year and a half. But we don't know. And until we see that change, we are being super optimistic if we describe this as an Egyptian, at least, spring. But let's go into the background a bit and then look at some of the local variations. Very briefly at some of the key events, developments over the last 11 months. And then I want to get back briefly to the business about Islamism and Western perspectives or relations with the West. In the Middle East generally, as everyone knows, we've been through a period of many decades, in most countries back to the period of political independence from European colonial powers in the 1940s and early 50s. A period of autocracy. The autocracy has had different character in different countries. In some places it's been very quickly became military autocracy, allied very closely with a socialist political ideology, thinking of places like Syria, Iraq, Egypt. Or it's been a feudal, tribal, stroke monarchical aristocracy, in particular in places in the Arabian Peninsula, but also in milder forms in countries like Jordan and Morocco. The only country which consistently and continuously has had some form of plural government, to avoid using the term democracy, where governments could change as the result of elections, or in part as the result of elections, has been Lebanon. Interestingly, one Middle Eastern country was added to that category, not an Arab one, Iran, in 1979-80. For a long time, really until the election a year and a half ago, it's very difficult to contest a claim that Iran has been among the most parliamentary democratic countries in the Middle East. Governments changed, parliaments changed as a result of elections. And elections, until the one year and a half ago, were reasonably free. They were arguably freer than the one that took place in Florida in the year 2000. So what has been happening over those decades? Now, it's very interesting. One of the things that's characteristic of the secular autocratic countries like Egypt, Syria and Iraq is that the position of women has improved enormously in comparison with the more feudal countries. It's equally clear that the population has experienced a long period of increasing education. Literacy rates have risen. University education has expanded enormously. The governments, the autocratic socialist military governments of the 1950s and the 60s had adopted development targets, concepts of national development, which involved industrialization, modernization of agriculture, incorporation into the workforce of as many sectors of the population as possible, including women, increasing the educational level of the population so it could become more economically productive, etc., etc. Now, if you go through that list, you're really talking about the economic development priorities set by the Western development economic experts of Oxford and Cambridge, of Harvard and Yale, of the IMF and the World Bank, and so on. Ironically, while economies have improved and GDP per head gone up and down a bit, but generally have improved also, the problem has been that the system has not followed the developments that the systems themselves have instigated in the population. So over the decades, you've got to a situation where by the year 2000, you had political systems in place which had existed more or less unchanged since 1960, different dates for different countries. But with a population, a society and an economy which in many ways had developed more and more away from those. The systems hadn't kept pace with the realities on the ground. And that inevitably had to create growing tensions between the political system, those who held the levers of power, be they economic, social, or the monopoly of violence in the form of army and interior ministry forces and so on. Now, until 1990, this increased tension between system and society was sustainable because it could be hidden away underneath the global tensions of the Cold War. You could be reasonably certain that if you stuck to the script dictated either from Moscow or from Washington, that you would be protected. Your position in power would be defended. That was why it was such a challenge to the Cold War system and such a turnaround in Egypt when Anwar Sadat in 1972 shifted from Moscow to Washington. Of course, as I suggest, there are local variations in all of this. But to illustrate one of the more extreme, small extreme example of the tensions, I was visiting the president of the United Arab Emirates University in Al Ain about 10 years ago, and I was kept waiting a bit, as one is, in the waiting room. I'd arrived early, that was my fault, but then you don't expect to be received on time anyway, so that was their fault. So I had half an hour to kill, and I was given the latest annual report of the university, which included tables and statistics on the previous academic year's student body. In every single faculty, including engineering, there were more women students than men. The graduating marks of the graduating class of the previous academic year were also there, and in every single faculty, the women on average scored between 5 and 10 points higher than the men. Now this is in the Emirates. And if you look at what society is like in the Emirates, in terms of divisions of social power and influence and activity and so on, there is a million miles difference between those statistics and the reality out in society. In Saudi Arabia, it's 15 years ago now that experts were suggesting, and the interesting thing about Saudi is that you may not like their Islam, but at least they take it seriously, which means that Islamic family law, inheritance law, is actually implemented according to the letter in Saudi Arabia. There are very few Muslim countries where women actually get to inherit their right according to the Sharia. In Saudi Arabia, they do. And of course, as anybody who knows standard classical Islamic family law knows, women inherit half of their male counterpart. But what they inherit is totally theirs to do with what they like. There are no obligations on them. They do not have to look after their kids, their family, their husbands and parents, whatever. That's the men's job. And that's why when men inherit double the amount of women, you'd also be pretty certain that they lose a lot of it pretty quickly. Women get to keep what they have inherited. And by 15 years ago, experts were estimating that over half of private capital in Saudi Arabia was owned by women. Now that, sooner or later, must have consequences. And one is seeing the slight bits of wave on the surface in the last few years as a result of this. Saudi society changes slowly. Just two examples. But if we then split up and look at the various countries, we'll see, it isn't time to go into a lot of detail, but it's worth looking at each of the individual countries in the Middle Eastern region, from Morocco to Iraq. Let's leave the non-Arab countries out of it for the time being. In some countries, the tribal system is still enormously strong. Not just ideally, but factually. So as you look at each individual country, it's worth looking first at the continuing significance of tribal networks as bases for access to political power, as bases for access to economic resources. Another factor that's worth looking at in various countries is regional differences, regional tensions, regional rivalries. Here, Syria is a very interesting case because historically they have always been. Aleppo and Damascus were never, until the modern state, were never part of the same administrative division. Aleppo was for several centuries the larger and more important of the two cities. Aleppo had very strong connections across the northern tier of the Fertile Crescent. Aleppo and Mosul, in modern-day Iraq, were twin cities in many ways, and families intermarried and so on, much more than they linked north-south. And in modern Syria, that distinction continues. I know I lived in Damascus for 2 years, but my wife comes from Aleppo, and damn it, we knew it. And then there's the east. There's the direct east around Deir Zor on the Euphrates, but there's also the far northeast out towards the Tigris. And there are traditional regional prides, regional priorities, regional rivalries there, not to mention the coastal cities and so on. And you can begin to identify similar kind of very, very strongly held regional loyalties and identities in many different countries. Then, of course, there's the one factor, the third of these, the one factor that is first noticed in the Western media among politics, namely the sectarian differences, the confessional differences. We are very interested in this part of the world in Middle Eastern Christians, that is, if we know they exist. In many parts of the West, we don't know that they exist. We did have a case in Selly Oak once in Birmingham where a Palestinian Christian student lived in a college, an Anglican college, and there were a number of medical people there who were being trained to go to Africa and Asia as medical missionaries. And they asked this Palestinian Christian woman, Christian, very nice. When did you become Christian? And Palestinian Christians are so used to being faced with this question that very often their reaction is to freeze or ignorance. She was unusually quick with this, but her response was, actually, it wasn't me that converted. One of my forefathers was converted by Christ. I got that. Brilliant answer. But since the Lebanese Civil War, which was very much framed in Western media and among Western politicians as a Christian-Muslim conflict, which it wasn't, primarily, secondarily, yes, people have tended to see Christian-Muslim or other forms of sectarian conflict in many different places in the Middle East. We are much more interested in the fate of the Copts in Egypt than we are in the fate of communities as a whole, and similarly in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Fourthly, there are the ethnic divisions. And here in North Africa, over towards Morocco, we don't very often hear of the ethnic divisions between Arab and Berber. They are there. And they play out very differently in different North African countries. In the Middle East, of course, we hear frequently about Kurds. We do, especially in Denmark, of course. Denmark hosts Kurdish satellite TV channel. I shall not comment on its adherence. But you also get other kinds of inter-Arab ethnic tensions in a place like Jordan, between East Bankers and West Bankers, between Palestinians and tribals of the West Bank, and so on. The more you look, the more difficult it becomes to say anything general about the region. You really have to talk about the events in terms of Egypt, in terms of Tunis, in terms of Syria, etc., etc. The local and regional, international politics play in. Bahrain is a fascinating case. Al Jazeera, which supports the uprising all over the place, doesn't mention Bahrain. And one wonders why. The Saudis have been effectively allowed to invade and occupy Bahrain. Nobody talks of it in those terms, but effectively that's what it is. Why? Might it have something to do with the fact that Bahrain is the base of one of the major US fleets? Does that suggest perhaps that the US has given Saudi Arabia the green light to occupy Bahrain? I only ask. Then, of course, once these events start, they create their own chain of effects. The Egypt that we see today is not the same Egypt that we saw at the beginning of January. It's been affected by the events. And first and foremost, of course, it's been affected economically. The economy has dived. The economy in Syria has dived. The economy in Tunisia has dived, even though tourists are beginning to go back. And there's more to come. Once you begin to get elections like the one in Tunisia and like the ones that are coming up in the very near future in Egypt, what do we expect to see there? And there again, the media expect one thing. But the media have been caught, imprisoned by their own framing of what's going on. And that has as much to do with media technology as it has to do with anything else. The uprising in Egypt is seen in the West overwhelmingly through the perspectives of Tahrir Square. The uprising in Egypt is Tahrir Square in what we have seen. Very occasionally you might get a report from Alexandria. But things happened in Alexandria as well. Significant things happened in Alexandria. You could explain what's going on in a place like Egypt and what's going on in a place like Tunisia and elsewhere in terms of a broadening of the franchise, of the involvement of broader and broader parts of the population in the political game. Up till a year ago in Egypt, political control, political initiative, not necessarily control, but certainly political initiative, was in the hands of a very small core of people, institutions around President Mubarak. As the uprising took place through January, February, March, and to an extent since, the initiative moved onto Tahrir Square and its allied locations in Alexandria and elsewhere. But in a sense, the political initiative is still restricted. It's gone out to a much wider group of people, but it's restricted to the group of people that can push along the political agenda. The real test is when you move to election, because that is the point at which the whole of the population is drawn into the political process. And that involves, inevitably, the vast majority of the population from whom we have not until this point heard. The people in the countryside and the small provincial towns have not been heard. Our impression of the Egyptian uprising, of the Tunisian one before that, was what we saw from the capital. It is therefore no surprise that when the countryside, which ultimately is still the majority of the population, when the countryside is given a chance to have a say, it may very well have different priorities, different perspectives from the young people on Tahrir Square. It is no surprise, therefore, that an Islamist or a party with an Islamic discourse, with Islamic language, suddenly appears after all, it represents the majority of the population. And if that's not democracy, I don't know what is. Syria is in some ways the exception in all of this, because there, and that I think has to do with technology again, and the organisation, the mobilization of technology. The fact that in Syria we hear from Syria is a de-centred uprising. It is not centred on one particular location, controlled from one particular network of people around like that in square. Syria is fascinating because it's happening all over the place, and it's being reported from all over the place. We hear it from all over the place, not because there are reporters there. We know there aren't reporters there, not officially paid by news agencies, but lots of the local people. Somehow or other, the Syrians managed to get round the control mechanisms of the government and are able to use the social media, able to get round the email restrictions of the Syrian authorities and get the news out. So, in a dictatorship which has very much modelled itself on that of China, you can still get news from demonstrations in Deir ez-Zor, Qamishli, Latakia, Berak, etc., etc. And above all, of course, from Homs and Hama at the moment. Now, the way I've approached this would indicate to you how my take on the threat of Islamism. Islam is inevitably a political factor. For heaven's sake, the majority of the population is Muslims. And the rather more active, stroke pious Muslims than the majority of the Christian population of a country like Denmark. So you have a variety, therefore, also of politically active Muslim, stroke Islamic groupings, movements, and so on. For me, one of the most interesting things that has happened in the last decade, until about the year 2000, until about 9/11, which is actually, that's just the dating, it's totally irrelevant in this connection. Until about 10 years ago, if you, in the Arab world, talked Islam and politics, you inevitably moved into a spectrum of the Muslim Brotherhood and out to the extremes. The left-hand end, or the moderate end of the spectrum, whatever you want to call it, was the moderate end of the Muslim Brotherhood. There were no other options, except among a few individual intellectuals who had very little public audience, and many of whom, for political reasons, had to move to Western universities. And some of the leading modernizing Islamic intellectuals are at American universities, partly because American universities find them attractive, but also because it's not a very good idea to stay in certain parts of the Muslim world if your idea is not acceptable to the regime or to the majority, the power holders of the conservative Islamic institutions like Al-Azhar. So really anything beyond the moderate and modernizing left-hand end of the Muslim Brotherhood, anything beyond that was not conceivable. Turkey changed that. With the coming to power of AK and Erdogan in Turkey, you suddenly had the option presented to a broad range of people in the Arab world who were Islamically motivated. You suddenly had presented an option which was clearly viable, or seemed to be. Come back in 20 years' time and tell me whether it was or wasn't. But at the moment, it's clearly viable. It's pushed Turkey forward enormously in these 10 years. Turkey, in terms of economic development, social development, political development, even by the Copenhagen criteria of the European Union, has progressed more in the last 10 years than it had in the previous 40. And its GDP has risen. I mean, here you had an Islamically led country, an Islamically led society and economy, which actually in the last 3 or 4 years has been damn sight more successful than any of the European ones, with the possible exception of Sweden. So, what's to argue with? And suddenly, that moderate modernizing end of the spectrum opens up. It's no coincidence that one of the first things that Rasim Ghannouchi says when he returns to Tunis from London exile, the leader of the Nahda party, is the Islamic polity we want is that of Turkey. Now, he means it, I know that 20 years back, his daughters were even more radically democratic and modernizing than he is. For him, the model is Turkey. And the war we thunder away, the one you saw on Deadline the other night with our good friend Nasser Kadri, Abdul Wahid was absolutely right. One, it's their governments, it's their democracy. And two, constantly picking on the negative aspects of Islamism, Islamic politics, closes off the door to the development of the other. And that brings me to my last point, the relationship with the West. I'm provoking you. I mean, you wanted some dynamics. I'm provoking you to the point you understand. My last point is relations with the West. It's interesting, if you go back to the beginning of the 19th century, when in the Arab world, and symbolized very much in the first Egyptian contacts with Western Europe after Napoleon's invasion of 1798, and Muhammad Ali's development of the country from around 1810 up to 1840, Europe was a model not just for economic and military power, but for many Islamic theologians at Al-Azhar who had spent time as young men sent to Paris and London to learn the languages so they could translate military manuals. But of course, once they were in Paris, they didn't just learn the language, they saw other things. And this was Paris, remember, after the revolution. And they came back with ideas about democracy, about the participation of the people, the rule of law, accountable government, all of these things that we see as the good things of our governmental systems when they're at their best. And they thought, hang on, this is totally in line with Islamic principles. What we've got at the moment is a military dictatorship based on a feudal landowning class which keeps down the peasants and the craftsmen and everybody else. Islamic principles dictate, these Azharites said, that these principles that these careful Europeans have discovered are actually Islamic. And it was Muhammad Abdul, 100 years later, almost, came back from exile in Paris. Very well known saying. Muhammad Abdul came back from exile in Paris to Egypt and said, is supposed to have said, well, not supposed to, he said, that in Europe, he saw Islam but no Muslims. And when he came back to Egypt, he saw Muslims but no Islam. Very interesting, if you think about it, a very interesting comment. But of course, Europe and the West has consistently, through incompetence, absence of understanding, and so on and so forth, has consistently done everything it could to undermine this credibility. Europe talks about democracy, we go back to the 20s and 30s when the French and the English really ended up with full control of the region after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We talked about democracy and participation of the people, etc., in government. But not for you primitives across the Mediterranean. Human rights, only at home. Economic development, yes, but to our profit. And so on and so forth. And then after the Second World War, we move into the Cold War. And all the talk about human rights clearly is used by the West as an instrument against the East. And after the end of the Cold War, we see democracy being used as an instrument of political and diplomatic contest. Our democracy, not yours. If you vote in, as we saw in Algeria in the early 90s, where the military, God knows what persuaded the military to hold elections, it's against their nature, but they did. And the moment it turned out that FIS, the Islamic Party, looked as if they were going to have a majority, they were basically told, sorry folks, we want democracy, but this is the wrong answer, so close it down. And you certainly get the impression from the West, the discussions around the election results in Tunisia, that this was the wrong answer. And if the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, become significantly the largest party in Egypt after the next lot of elections, there will be a lot of people who say, it's the wrong answer, you're not mature enough, by implication, you're not mature enough to have democracy yet. And there's therefore no surprise when Arabs, Muslim and Christian, to different degrees, there's not all that much difference between Muslims and Christians on this one, they don't trust the West. Historically, they've got very good reasons not to trust the West. And the West, with its very short historical memory, cannot understand why it is that they are not trusted. This is something that happened 30 or 40 years ago. It's water under the bridge. I mean, let's get on with it. I have this image, and I'll finish on that. I have this image in March 2003 when the Americans and the British started shock and awe bombing Baghdad, of families sitting in the air raid shelters in the basements of their buildings in 3 or 4 generations, with the old grandfather sitting there with the kids, telling them, we've been through this before, back in the 1920s, the British attacked and we beat them. And they did. The British had to withdraw at one point in the 1920s. People still remember Sykes-Picot. In Algeria, Abdel Qadir is still a hero. This asymmetry of historical memory is one which constantly traps. It trapped London in relation to Ireland. London could not understand why something that happened in 1688, in the Battle of the Boyne, and Protestant William sending in his troops to defeat Irish uprisings. London could not understand why that still mattered, as if it had happened yesterday. So those are some reflections, and I'll let you take control again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the long but very informative presentation.
She would get that.
Almost 99% agreeing with you. From
I didn't expect 100 from you.
But that 1% disagreement is very, for my sake, very important, which I would like some explanation from you. You use terminology like threat of Islamism and Islamist ideology. I spoke with the president of Turkey in February about this issue of Turkey being an Islamist state, or the Turkish government of parties being Islamist, and he refused. He said, look, in Turkey, in our government, we do not mix politics with religion. Turkey is 99% Muslim, and so is all the Muslim countries, so there is no question of calling one party Islamist or Islamic. And as far as my personal view is concerned, the word Islamist and Islamism is an insult to people, because in Islamic scripture, in Quran, there is no mention of any of these kind of words. So why people like yourself, and also unfortunately some Eastern and Muslim scholars have also started using the term, when we know that the connotation of the word Islamist is in the context of violence and killing, and anybody who doesn't agree with the Western way of thinking is an Islamist. So why do you use this word? Why can't we just say religious parties, instead of calling them Islamist, when you know what the West means by that?
Well, basically because in the academic language, and this implies also in the Arab world, the term Islamist, Islami, al-Islamiyun, is used to denote those political parties and movements whose program is explicitly Islamic, with the purpose of setting up an Islamic state in their language. Right? I can't help that they use that language.
The term came from France. It didn't come from the Arab country. That's my point. That
there's lots of things that are used in contemporary Arab, Islamic and non-Islamic politics which came from other places. That doesn't mean that, and that doesn't mean that it's illegitimate, because if you go right back through Islamic history, or aren't I allowed to use the term Islamic history?
You use the word Islamic history.
Yeah. I would claim I'm entitled to use the term Islamic history.
You can use whatever you like as an academic, but I'm not thinking of academic
but I would
discourse. I'm thinking of what is happening in the society.
Certain media use Islamist as an insult.
Also politicians use the same.
Well, media politicians. They use Islamist as an insult or as a red light warning of danger. And clearly AK is not an Islamist party, nor is Turkey, definitely is not an Islamist state, it's a secular state. The constitution is as secular as the Danish constitution, including an officially government-supported church in Turkey as well as here. We're very much like each other. But Erdogan would not deny, and certainly many of his members of parliament would not deny, that that many of their policies are informed by Islamic principles. You can't. If Erdogan argues that that is a a wrong statement about his party and his party's policy, then he is being too clever by half.
Can I ask this one more question?
Yes, you can.
I understand very well, and I have no objection to a party calling themselves Islamic Party. In Pakistan, we also have Jamaat Islami, and in other countries they have. My contest.
There's an Islamist party.
Yeah, but no, they're not. They are a religious party, and you continuously in the West start mixing this terminology, which confuses other people too. You have, for example, in Pakistan, there are a lot of parties which are not secular, but they are quite liberal. Then you have a religious party. In Pakistan, they have a name called Jamaat Islami. But in other countries, in Turkey or in Tunisia, they don't call themselves Islamist party, they have a name. But in the West, we don't use their name, we always call them Islamist party. And this is what people don't, why to call them with a particular label on them, which we know that label both in the media and in the politics and also among some academics in the West is connected with violence and negativity. And that is what is very, that's what people don't understand, why keep on calling people with a name which they don't like. I have spoken with hundreds and hundreds of people with Muslim background in Europe, they don't like this word. They say, why you keep on calling them Islamist? Turkey is 99% Muslim, and they have different parties, So it means you say, AK party is Islamist or Islamic, while others are also Muslim.
I'm not saying that.
I'm
not saying that about but there's no way. There's no way the Jamaat Islami is Islamist. It calls itself Islamic.
Never they call it. There's a big difference between Islamic party or party which is based on Islamic principle and the way they are labeled as Islamist. This is the difference I'm trying to make.
You've got two problems here. One is the use of terms by academics and the misuse of those terms by the popular media. And that's not just in our field, it's in every field. You can from an academic side, and I would resist that, you can conclude that therefore you need to drop the term. That allows the media and the public discourse to determine how and what we discuss. Right? Now we can discuss that, but that's my starting point. And certainly, and I'm telling you that in the academic world, as a technical term, Islamist is used for those parties and movements that have a program of instituted a state based on Islamic principles by their own programs. Right? The other problem is a more deeply academic and general philosophical problem, is the whole problem of categorization. How do we talk about anybody or anything without labeling it? That's one we can have. I mean, there are actually 10-week courses about that problem in the university.